Well, welcome. We have a good crowd. This is awesome. For those of you, I don't know if I see any familiar faces. I'm Dr. Billie Murray. I work in the Department of Communication. I do see one familiar face. I work in the Department of Communication all the way over in Gary Hall across the world from where we are right now. And I specialize in rhetoric and social justice. That is kind of what I study. I study social protest. And so I'm always, of course, very interested in the work of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so I'm going to talk to you about that as sort of my academic researcher hat and how I do that sort of work. I'm also an activist in a lot of parts of my life and have been for a number of years, so I kind of get to wear two hats and get to call it work all the time, which is really nice to have a job that lets you go be an activist. So that's a little bit about me. And
I have a similar privilege in ways. My name is Will Stehl. I'm a Associate Director in Campus Ministry and a staff member in the Center for Peace and Justice Education. So I too in my job get to actually organize programs that are orchestrated around issues of service and social justice. And in particular, my involvement here is simply that I live down in Philadelphia. So while Occupy Philadelphia was going on, I had the opportunity to go down there and a handful of times kind of witness or take part in whatever was going on down there. So to learn it firsthand, which is very, very different, as you'll see from the way we learn things through the media.
So today, this is how we're going to kind of structure what we're talking about. And we are going to ask you guys to talk to us a little bit as well, so we're not lecturing at you the entire time. But what we're going to focus on is talking about, as a starting point, one of Martin Luther King's most famous writings, which was Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Have any of you ever heard of that, maybe read it or something for a class or just because it's super fun? Okay, so this was actually a response that King had crafted to the clergy in Birmingham, Alabama, who had sent out a message saying that they didn't approve of his activities, protesting, civil disobedience, that sort of thing, things that landed him in jail in Birmingham. So he responded to them in an open letter. It was published in the newspaper, but so he's actually addressing these clergy members. So all of the quotes that I'm going to read to you today from that letter are from King specifically. So in his letter, which was this response, he stated that we had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. So this is kind of a very abstract, even though quite eloquent, understanding of direct action. And the title of our presentation today is Why Protest? From MLK to OWS. So while we have this sort of abstract notion that King gives us about presenting our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the community, we're going to talk to you today about a bit more of the concrete conditions under which direct action, or more specifically protest, so we'll kind of use those words interchangeably, occurs and how this activity is understood by various publics. So drawing on King's letter and our own interactions and understandings of the Occupy movement, we're going to explore what it means to engage in democratic participation and to exercise our First Amendment rights in our current moment. So our question for you to kind of start off is, what do you think about when you hear the word protest? You can just sort of yell it out. What does that mean for you?
A visual like display of a disagreement that's going on,
Okay.
Putting forth like a different set of values.
Okay, putting forth a different set of values, a visual display, even like an embodied display, right? What else? That's good. What else?
Frustration.
Frustration, tell me more.
Frustration toward someone of a higher power.
Okay, so frustration on the part of the protesters themselves. What does a protester look like?
Buddhist monks burning in the streets.
Buddhist monks, right? The very famous iconic photograph of the monk setting himself on fire in protest, which is pretty extreme, right? In its display. What else? What kind of images come to mind, either historically or currently?
Picket signs.
Picket signs.
Kind of grungy.
Grungy.
Down the street.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, grungy. Lots of people.
Yeah.
We heard the Buddhist monk thing, which is sort of an individual engaging in protest, right? Versus like a mass demonstration, right?
Yeah, I was going to say like March for Life kind of thing.
Right, so like marches for like pro-choice, pro-life, those kinds of things that are masses of people, which is kind of more along what King was talking about, right? Masses of people protesting, in his case, segregation, right? That sort of thing. So these images that you have in your mind of this, where do they come from? The news, photographs that you've seen where?
In books, on the television, on
Books.
flyers.
History class, right? Because it's not something you were alive for when it was actually happening for some of these, right? Except for the Occupy stuff, which you're very much a part of, and historically. All right, good. So why do people do this? Like, what gets them to that point? I mean, somebody set themselves on fire. That's sort of the most amazing example, right? Did they just start there? Oh, I'm kind of mad about something. I think I'm going to go run out in the street.
Probably when they feel like repeated voicing concern, and it's happened more than once, and they get to a breaking point where it's like, if we don't take some sort of like serious, drastic, more visual action, no one's really going to pay any attention.
Right, so maybe when nobody's paying attention, right? When you've said these things, you've done, what are the things you do first? Petitions. What else? Not necessarily you, but somebody.
Letters to like your government or whatever.
Letters to your Congress people, letters to the president. I sent an email to the president like for the first time a couple weeks ago. He responded. I mean, the form thing, it was totally not about what I wrote about, which I thought was sort of bad PR, but whatever. So letters to the editor maybe that are like in the paper, that sort of thing. Petitions. Posters.
Small groups of people.
Right, so like going to people, right, small groups of people, like let's sit down and talk about what's going on. Like if something's wrong at Villanova, you're going to find out who you need to talk to get it fixed, right? Maybe it's Father Peter, maybe it's one of the deans, maybe it's the chair of a department, something like that, right? So protest tends to be justified according to these kind of things, sort of like as a last resort, right? When something else hasn't worked, right? And that's what King is going to talk about in particular. So what King argued was that the white power structure left black communities with no other alternatives except direct action. They had no options, he said, due to police brutality, discriminatory voting laws, and segregation. So he's telling these clergy members, what else was I going to do, right? We had to take to the streets. That's who will.
Okay, let's,
So I can stop talking.
Yep, you got it. Sorry. Got a piece there. So similarly with the Occupy movement, there's some core issues going on with the basic root cause of why this is happening in some ways is just an understanding that people feel like they no longer have access really to their voice is no longer heard, right? There's not access to the democratic process or to the government itself. And so through those normal means and such. So with that, the Occupy movement has taken on some very, very interesting manifestations in how it's moved forward. But in particular, even though there are a range of issues, and we'll talk about that, it's really important to understand that some core ones get to this root of what it means to be democratic, right? So some of the key issues are basically, if you look at the pattern, the effect of money on politics, right? And often you guys, maybe you've heard the Supreme Court case of Citizens United, right? Which 2 years ago, as of last Friday, was a decision that really started the principle or notion of corporate personhood. So what this did is it opened up the door for money to be engaged with our political system in a way that creates a lot of consequences. Because basically, to paraphrase the way the Occupy movement understands this is that the Supreme Court said that corporations are people, they're persons, right? They have personhood. But they don't have a voice as a human body does, but so the ability to give a donation or money is an expression of free speech. The issue, though, that the Occupy movement in particular kind of gets at is that if a democracy is built upon equality and everyone having at their core their voice, right? political power is based upon your ability to vote, to have a voice, then if free speech and the ability to have a voice is equated with money, then the more money you have, the more of a voice you have, the more of power you have. And so that, if that dynamic persists, the voices who have a greater, the larger voices tend to have the structure and the policies shaped towards what it is that they're kind of lobbying for.
So I'm guessing that maybe the majority of people didn't even know what was meant by the term corporate personhood until Occupy kind of came on the scene. Like there was news about it, and maybe some people who were kind of paying attention sort of got this. But just like some of you said, there wasn't that much of an awareness about it. So what Martin Luther King says when he talks about protest and why people do this kind of thing is that, quote, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issues. It seeks to dramatize the issues so that it can no longer be ignored. This is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. So for him, the first step was, this is a way to wake people up, right? To find out what are the issues, what are the things that are wrong that we need to sort of get out there and raise that awareness about. But this was a 4-step process for him, and we're just going to talk about the first step today for this part. And his first step, he said, and this is for what he said to do, but also this is what Occupy is trying to do, is to, quote, collect the facts to determine whether injustices exist. So Will's going to talk a little bit about, well, how did Occupy do that first step? How did they collect the facts?
And two of the things that have made Occupy, the Occupy movement, absolutely fascinating and something very distinct in our history are two things. One, obviously the physical occupation of a space and 24 hours a day is something that I wouldn't say is unprecedented, but certainly haven't seen in a very long time in the sense of kind of setting up shop. I mean, that's definitely making a very strong statement as opposed to a march or something in certain ways. The other thing that makes it very distinct, and interestingly enough, when those who were organizing the very first Occupy protests were getting together, there were individuals from Europe who had been a part of this chain of protest and democratic renewal that had been spreading from the Arab Spring to Spain, to Greece, and then Wisconsin earlier in the year here in the United States. And when they were deciding to do something with this, this movement, this energy that was building about gathering together to kind of address issues, the Spaniards who were there actually introduced the idea of, hey, one of the things that really succeeded in Spain was we had tents, we were in a community, but we also had a general assembly, which is basically this meta level. And so it's a sense, what makes it absolutely unique is that it creates a space for people to have access for their voice to be heard. And it's filling the gap that no matter what your core issue might be, you know, for your voice to be heard in some ways. This is why it gained a lot of momentum very quickly, is because it was able to kind of garner a lot of different people coming from a lot of different places and basically foster an organic, self-organizing, non-hierarchical kind of direct democracy in action. So it was actually embodying some of the hopes it would like to see out of our own government, right? So that the way it would function, everyone has an opportunity to be heard. Everyone has an equal voice. We're going to actually engage in such a way so that we foster dialogue in a constructive manner as much as possible to move ourselves forward. But what was most core to the way a General Assembly works is the idea of inclusion, and that everyone has access and a voice. So there's some things as you hear. I'm going to explain how Occupy Philadelphia manifested their General Assembly kind of process, and you'll probably undoubtedly see some things with it that you would question, but we'll get to that. So the basic idea is General Assembly happens every day when the occupation was going on, and at 7 o'clock. People would gather, and it would begin with a group of facilitators. So there was a group of individuals who kind of set aside their voice for this 2 hours and said, we're going to help give some structure so that people have the opportunity to have a voice. We're going to mediate. First thing they would do is they would take announcements that might come up about what's going on in the camp, outside of the camp movements. And then the working groups would report back, because one of the things that started to happen as the self-organizing was happening, as people occupied a physical space together, as conversations started happening. And people with similar interests or affinity groups became working groups. And they said, you know what? We really care about the environment, or we actually really care about housing foreclosures. We're going to set up a little group for economic empowerment, or we're going to set up a group because people need to be fed here in the camp. We're going to have a food committee. And these working groups would have an opportunity to report back what they're doing, what they needed, so the community understood as a whole what was going on. So it's evolving into a lot more than simply a political structure, but a civic structure, a community that is more of an organic entity that has a life of its own that kind of propelled it forward. Now, the last part, one of the most important parts of the General Assembly, is the proposals, because this is where the community decides as a whole that they are going to make a decision on what is said, what is done, how to move forward. And interestingly, it's very difficult sometimes for people to make it down there, but one of the unique things about the last year is how these protest movements have been interactive with our current technology and media. So every General Assembly is broadcast on live stream, and people have the opportunity to actually ask questions and participate over the internet, even though they're not in the space. And so when the facilitation begins, a proposal is brought forward from a working group. So people want to say, we have a state, we want Occupy Philadelphia to sponsor and back a march to the Federal Reserve to protest sort of the bailouts on this such and such a date. They'll announce that. The next step is clarifying questions. If people within the assembly don't understand what's going on, everyone has an opportunity. They actually go around before that begins, and you take hands and you get on a list called stack. You take it for a minute, they close it down. Clarifying questions. Okay, that's been resolved. Open up stack. We're going to take concerns. So now if you actually have something of a concern about doing this, an objection, something that the community should consider in making this decision, this is the time to air that. After concerns have been heard, they take up stack and they move to friendly amendments. So after people have kind of heard clarifying questions and concerns, they may want to still move forward with this, and they have a friendly amendment. They call it a friendly amendment, Philadelphia, because too often it would be too easy for someone to kind of shut something down in the consensus process, and they can do that on their own outside of this. So this is really, what can you do to enhance this or curb it in a way so that it most reflects the will of the community and what they're trying to do. That in itself is kind of tricky, because the friendly amendment process goes through its own little subset of clarifying questions. Anyone who comes forward with an amendment, who has has concerns about the friendly amendment, then they take a vote. Do we want to adopt this friendly amendment? Straw poll, get a general feel. Then they go to a binding vote. It's really procedural, right? You can get the sense that there's a lot going on to make sure everybody's heard. And that can go on for a great deal of time, depending on how many friendly amendments there might be. When all those are done, they restate the proposal after it's been refined by the Assembly, and then they do a straw poll again to get a general sense of how the voting's going to go and whether or not they need to really get the counters out. So you could see the thing with Philadelphia is although it's trying to work through the inclusive model and under a consensus philosophy, ultimately they don't use full consensus at the end of the vote. They do take a vote into account. And so then they take a binding vote, and that's whether or not this proposal's been passed or not. So you go through all that time and it's not, you can see where some things can get kind of tangled or can get kind of frustrating, or there can be some things to be worked out in the process. So it's very human, and it's kind of messy in some ways because it is very human. But they do all of that to make sure that everybody has a voice. There's a young man who is intellectually challenged, and he raises his voice. His voice in the community, it's always heard. It's always given an opportunity to speak, and they're very kind with him. The assembly is a really interesting gathering where you have homeless who are participating, handicapped, all different groups from all different walks of life. So it's trying to embody this sense of everyone's welcome and everyone has a voice in how we move forward. Okay. With that, just one of the things I wanted to mention too is, even though it may seem tedious in some ways, it is kind of what's interesting is that it's literally embodying an alternative to the structure that they find is not working. So they're trying to live out an embodiment of that in some ways. And interestingly enough, you find that all that process is done to ensure the effectiveness of their mission, which is to have inclusivity and equality and respect for every single member that's there. Nobody's counted out. So that effectiveness is sometimes put as a higher value than efficiency, getting it done quickly, which is an interesting inversion of kind of our corporate culture that becomes more and more a part of our society and our mentality, that efficiency is key, and that some often critique is a part of how our crisis even developed in the financial arena anyhow.
So what's like the number one sort of criticism that you've heard of the Occupy movement? Whether you agree with them or not, just what are some of the things that you've heard that are negative?
That the people there don't really know what they're protesting or what they want.
They don't know what they're protesting, they don't know what they want. What else? Is that sort of the main one? What else?
That there's health concerns in the camp, that people aren't like maintaining it to a point where it's safe for
Okay.
everyone to be there.
So that the camps that don't really exist anymore, but that there were health concerns and things like that. Anything else? Mm-hmm.
There's like the population of the older generation, you think that the Wall Street protesters are overprivileged youths who have nothing better to do with their time than to complain about things they have no understanding of, etc.
So again, I ask you, where do those come from? Where do you hear those? Whether you agree with them or not, where do those messages come from? If it's smelly, stinky, unhygienic, they don't know what they're protesting about. It's just a bunch of young, idealistic people that they don't really know how the world works. Where do you get those messages?
Media.
Okay, so from the media, right? So, and I don't want to vilify the media. I'm a communication professional. I don't want to vilify the media. But we'll talk about the media in a minute. But we get these messages from a lot of different places. And the process that Will has just explained to you doesn't really come across very well in a soundbite. It's not something you can take a picture of. I sort of showed you a picture, right? Here. This is a General Assembly. It's messy. There's a lot of people in there. Can you imagine having to facilitate a meeting with that many people, right? But this is sort of theoretically the ideal of what democracy is supposed to look like, right? A bunch of people getting together and talking about what's wrong, what's not working. Are there environmental issues? Are there race issues? Are there gender issues? Is this corporate personhood thing keeping us from getting our voices heard? And like Will said, in these spaces, everyone is heard. People that are physically challenged, people that are intellectually challenged, people of different races, ethnicities, genders, etc. Right? When's the last time you heard a homeless person be able to have a forum to speak, right? So then we get to this question of, well, they don't really know what they're talking about, and it's just too much. What do they want? They want everything. Well, that's kind of the point, right? This is about the process of identifying what are the problems. They're still in that process, right? This is still a conversation, not just this is how we're going to solve the problem. The efficiency model, right? They're saying, whoa, we can't solve the problem yet. We don't know what all the different points of the problem are. How can we solve it if we don't really understand it yet? And this process is how we will come to understand all the ways that these issues are connected and articulated together. So one of the things I tend to hear about the Occupy movement that was sort of the catchphrase for a while is that it's a leaderless movement. Well, that's really hard to deal with when you're a reporter. So think about being a reporter and you're going to go down to the Occupy camp and you have good intentions. You want to get some information. Why are you here? What is it that you want? Well, if there's no leader or no spokesperson, like Martin Luther King, like we were talking about, who whose face do you stick that microphone in? Right? So the nature of a leaderless movement is kind of hard for people to understand because of our history in this country of understanding how social movements work. There's a Malcolm X, there's a Elizabeth Cady Stanton, there's a Martin Luther King, there's a Gloria Steinem. There's always a somebody that's the spokesperson. Well, what Occupy says is, we don't want somebody to speak for us. We want to speak for ourselves. We want our voices to be heard. And yeah, we each have different stories, different issues, different problems that need to be addressed. But this is what democracy looks like, right? It's not just having your voices heard, but it's also having that responsibility, right? We're all responsible for what goes on here, right? Not just this one person who we said, that's our leader, they're responsible. No, we're all responsible. We're all a part of this. And like Will said, this is not just some pie in the sky kind of thing. This is embodying what they see as wrong with the democratic process, right? The process isn't working for 99% of the people, as the argument goes. So this is what a process could look like. And we're going to show you, we're going to model that. Does that make sense? So move.
Just,
go ahead.
Just one really brief quote that I found really engaging about how to sum up the way they view the way power is held, used, and defines and makes decisions in our culture. Is just there's some people I overheard saying nothing about us without us. So that's that sense that the voice always must be heard. And there's a gentleman down there who's actually a professor at a nearby university who ran the education tent, and he was really asked the issues with the leaderless movement. And he had actually said, well, this is the really, really challenging part because everybody's a leader, and that sounds cliche. But what that means is, as Billie was referring to, is that if there's something you can't, the only person who's responsible for the way things are, if you object to them, is you. Like, it's up to you. Like, you are responsible. Everybody bears the burden of that responsibility. Everybody is necessary to participate. And that's how the model should move forward in there.
So it sounds like clearly what side of the fence we're on with this, right? Okay, so our politics are pretty clear, right? So what about this issue about hygiene and all of a sudden these encampments don't exist anymore, right? For the most part. They were evicted. So why is that? If all they're doing is sitting around having these meetings and talking about stuff, what's the big problem, right? So King says that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. So we saw this with the civil rights movement, right? We saw people getting moved out of public space with fire hoses, with police dogs, right? These kinds of things. We saw all of this violence, this police brutality. Martin Luther King wrote this when he was in jail, right? Removed from that space. So we've also seen this with Occupy.
And they're similar to the civil rights movement, that the idea of nonviolent protesters occupying a space really brings out that tension in power, right? People who choose to nonviolently make a protest are saying that the power is in our conviction and our voice, and although we're going to, that's going to draw conflict, that they believe that's constructive conflict, even though that's going to bring some consequences that aren't pleasant, maybe even violent, that to nonviolently endure that only really reveals the antagonist being and the oppressor actually being those in power, right? Because the state generally is thought as being the keeper of the peace and rather benevolent, but in those moments when nonviolence is actually embraced by the protesters, and it's actually the supposed benevolent protectors of the, defenders of the peace that are the ones who are violent, then that draws out attention about power and uses and abuses of power. So some examples that we're seeing that really started a lot more people understanding and seeing that things aren't exactly as hunky-dory as we thought is maybe in New York, right? There's this one image of these girls that were actually on the street as a part of one of the protests that were going on, and they were fenced in with an orange kind of one of those fence construction gates. And at some point, I don't know particularly what they're saying or not, but they were just pepper sprayed. And as the story goes, it was not warranted at all, but it was a particular police officer's reaction. So we're not here to indemnify the police as a whole either, but just demonstrate how abuses of power can happen and who really holds power, and the tension between that. So other examples that were really drastic, Oakland was the one that really captured most of the country. You guys at least caught wind of that if you haven't heard anything. When there was a particular protest going on, the police response was to be in riot gear and to really militarize in certain ways. So in order to even move the protesters, who at that point were nonviolent, right? They were using flash grenades and tear gas and rubber bullets. And an Iraq war vet who was like 21, 22 years old was hit in the head by a flash grenade and it fractured his skull. And so that brought out a lot of issues for our country, right? And revealed a lot about how the system can be very complicated and how power and oppression work. And that drew a lot more attention to it. So part of the idea that Martin Luther King is getting at is that to actually use direct action and nonviolence is to reveal the hidden tension that's there. And that way it can be addressed, right? That way other people who are on the side don't really know what this Occupy thing's about, don't really know if they agree or disagree. Well, they know that this isn't right, right? It'll draw a lot more in. Now, those are the more extreme examples. There are various relationships and with cities and municipalities that took place throughout. So the extremes comparisons would be Oakland and New York were much more violent, militarized in certain ways. Philadelphia and Los Angeles were embraced at the beginning. Mayor Nutter was down there, was saying a lot of really supportive things. And as the encampment grew and the critiques of some of the conditions down there, which there were, if you're down there, it's a much longer story, but there was an inherent tension between what was going on in embracing the homeless population that already occupied that space and the conditions there. It's a separate story. And then that changed in November. A lot of things changed. And what ended up coming out in the media in particular was that the mayor of Oakland said that the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and one other agency, National Security Agency maybe, were involved in a conference call with 18 major cities and the mayors to kind of have this, to put the movement to an end. So that draws out a lot of questions as to, well, why, right? Because in some ways in Philadelphia it had been existing, there were some conditions concerns for sure, and there were a lot of people trying to address that. They were also feeding 400 homeless a day, 3 meals a day, providing a space where the police weren't necessarily up and moving them, so they could actually have a sense of community and even participate in the movement itself and have a sense of purpose. So there was a humanization of particularly of the homeless population that was going on within these encampments that was something that was a social benefit in a lot of ways. So like, if we can do this with no funding, why can't our system provide for everyone, right? Idealistic questions, but nonetheless very critical questions to always make sure we ask. So with that, you also get other more benevolent municipalities. So like Baltimore, the Fraternal Order of Police actually came out and endorsed the Occupy encampment. So there was going to be no action. That was a certain politics on its own. A judge in the federal or state court, I think it was federal court, out in the Boston district, actually put an injunction on the eviction notice, drawing out this idea of free speech, right? Free speech is also tied to freedom of assembly, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But so the way that the institutions and civil servants in power reacted to it varied as well. But it definitely draws out a particular tension, particularly when it comes to the space itself, right? It's a very unique argument.
So that's actually what I do most of my research on, is trying to understand how protest and free speech and public space are connected. Because we've all sort of read the First Amendment, right? And the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or permitting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the right of the press. We've kind of heard that part. We get all of that, right? That's the easy part. The second clause of that amendment says, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So my question is, what pure ideal democracy looks like is people getting together to talk about the issues, right? And deciding what the issues and the problems are and how to solve them. What do you need to do that? You need a place. You need a space for people to be able to do that. And what the Occupy movement was really good about articulating was this right to public space. Because when we say things like, oh, we have a right to free speech, we get that. But there's a lot of restrictions on our right to free speech, historically, right? You can only speak in certain places. You can only speak about certain things. You can't falsely yell fire in a crowded theater and stuff like that, right? There are all kinds of rules. But when you say, I have a right to this space, that's a little bit different. And it's also very much ties in with their critique of the corporate personhood, right? Because who owns most of the space? Think about the public spaces you go. Where do you go? You go to the mall, you go to Starbucks, places like that that are owned. They're not public anymore. So where do you go? You go to a park that's, government supposed to be public space. You go to a place like Dilworth Plaza. That's a public space, right? It's in front of the, what is the name?
Hall?
The City Hall, right. It's in front of City Hall. I'm new here. I'm still learning my geography. It's in front of City Hall. What more public space could there be than that public square? And yet they're immediately kicked out. And you can see sort of this exuberant police force, right? Hundreds of police in riot gear. So what leads us to that point? And part of what the argument is, or for me in particular, the argument that I would make and that some critical geographers would make, is that since 9/11, we've increasingly started to think about public space as a threat, right? It's insecure space. We need to regulate it, right? You can't go here. You can't stand in this space for too long, right? You can't have this many people in this space, right? Because it's seen as a threat. So, and Martin Luther King argued that there is nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade. That's sort of been the rule for a long time. That makes sense, right? You got to be able to make sure that people don't get hurt, that sort of thing. We can't block up too much stuff, right? But he goes on to say, such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. He said that in the 1960s, and we're still making this argument today, that we have a right to this space because where else are we going to go to talk? Where else can we be, right, and get together to talk? So this is part of the way that they do this. So we've talked about the General Assemblies, we've talked about protest in a particular space. Will's going to talk a little bit now about how they sort of tried to push back against some of these sort of regulations.
One that's another hallmark and very, very interesting in how it evolved to actually become an advantage is that early on there were ordinances against sound amplification, right? Pretty reasonable ordinance. You could be here, but we don't want you to be so loud that you're disturbing others. Again, the tension of protest is trying to be heard. There's an inherent tension there. It's not right or wrong, but it's to recognize the tension to work out. And so with that ordinance, one of the responses was to come up with the use of the people's microphone. I don't know if you guys know what this is, but it was a way of amplifying what was being said through people power. And it has some very, very interesting and beneficial consequences. Does anyone know what that is and how it's used? You heard it before? Yeah.
Wasn't it kind of like one person would say something and then all the people closest to him would yell it, and then as it got further away, more and more people would say it until everybody had heard it?
Right, exactly. And the interesting thing about it is all you have to do to have your voice heard in a crowd of hundreds, thousands, is to yell, mic check. And the crowd responds, mic check, and then you know they're listening. And you have to be very intentional about the choice of words. This is also a benefit because it really only works at 4 or 5 words at a time in order for people to take them and amplify them again. But what's interesting is everyone has to really listen to what you're saying because they have to repeat it. And the nature that it has to be succinct and dense and meaningful and power-packed in the sense that everyone is really internalizing it in a different way, almost like why you're told just writing notes is helpful. It has an added benefit and power to like building a sense of identity in a community. It's scary as all get out if you hear it. It sounds like the Borg. It's absolutely like frightening.
They don't know what
first
that
to hear
means.
it.
They're too young.
Oh, it's a little Star Trek reference. All these like robots, they're all
like,
plugged
what?
into one another. It's like they're all one. But so there's another consequence of it that
I'm going to show
I
this
was
one
going to get
first.
into. Yeah.
So this is a mic check that happened in New York when Angela Davis came to give a speech. She couldn't use a bullhorn, she couldn't use a microphone, but everybody there wanted to hear her speech. I'm just going to show you a couple of minutes of it so you can see how this works, and then we have another example after that. I hope the volume works. I have no idea if it's going to work.
Mic check! Mic check! Thank you, Angela! Thank you, Angela! We now have time for questions!
We now have time for questions. Oh, ironic.
Riley will take stack.
Riley will take stack.
Please make sure she gets your eye contact.
Please make sure she gets your eye contact.
Come and tap her from behind.
Come and tap her from behind.
Also, we want to invite all of you in the back to sit down and stay a while.
So it's a way to relay instructions as well.
Who would like to be on stack? Who would like to be on stack? For questions for Angela.
Hi, Miss Davis. Professor
Hi, Miss
Davis.
Davis.
Thank you for all your work. My friend Angela and I just came from Zuccotti Park. And we're struggling and working to plan a day of action that amplifies all of what you just said. And fuses together the oppressions. That affect women. That affect trans people. That affect people of every color. And every nation of origin. And every difference that exists in this world. But
Okay, so that's just an idea to get you to see sort of the pragmatic issue of doing this, how they sort of use these to counter some of the regulations that people tried to put on their space. You can't use amplification equipment, you can't use a bullhorn, so this is how we're going to get out instructions, this is how we're going to have a conversation with masses of people, and sometimes they'll even do a double mic check where they have to repeat it twice, like he was saying, that goes back. What's interesting is the tactic actually got picked up as a way to disrupt certain things across the country, especially on college campuses. So when a recruiter from a major corporation would come to campus, these mic checks started getting picked up and people would disrupt that speaking event, okay, using the mic check tactic. They did it with politicians as well. So they would go to a public speech that a politician was going to give, and there would be people who had come to that place and planned a disruptive mic check in order to have their voices heard. So I'm going to show you an example of that happened with Governor Scott Walker. We're all familiar with him.
That's what we are.
So this is at a private dinner at the Chicago Union League Club, and they're there to support Governor Walker, and he's going to give a speech, and we're going to see how they sort of...
Are you guys familiar with Governor Scott Walker? And I alluded earlier. Anyone? Wisconsin.
Can we talk about it afterwards? Because I'm scared we're going to run out of time.
Yep, go for it.
We'll talk about it afterwards.
Oh.
Okay, sorry. Because I want to see this other stuff.
The expression of ideas.
One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Friend Scott Walker.
Development Corporation, a public-private entity, sole purpose is promoting commerce in the state of Wisconsin.
Mic check! Mic check! Mic check! Mic check!
Obviously, we got
And we see you at this fancy breakfast! And we see you at this fancy breakfast!
Their voices are a little bit different than others out there, but along the way.
On the lives of working families! On the lives of working families! Governor Walker's Bill 5! Governor Walker's Bill 5!
So we're used to
And
this.
it's up to the 99%! And it's up to the 99%! You got a picture of
You
him?
cannot living wages.
You cannot living wages!
And enough benefits to support their families. It is not so different from our own state. We're corporations and not all politicians.
Put the camera, 2 seconds. We have a round of applause.
Okay. So I see when I start talking about things like disruption, and I talk about this a lot in my public speaking about these kind of issues, people get a little bit nervous when we talk about interrupting a planned speech. Like we feel like, well, that's rude, or, you know, well, they have a right to talk too, right? So is that okay that they're doing that? And it sort of makes us a little bit uncomfortable. And it's because it's a disruption, right? It's a disruption of something that sort of feels like maybe we shouldn't do that. But what King would say is that the police and other people who've tried to sort of stop these sorts of things and sort of keep us from having disruptions, like disruptive protests that stand in the way of traffic. I'm just trying to get to work. Why do you have to be in the way? I'm trying to get to work, right? Or things like this. We're just trying to have our breakfast. Why do you have to kind of disrupt all of this? King says that people who are more devoted to order than to justice, who prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. He stated that we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring it to the surface, the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with. So his argument is that you can have peace, right? You can have order. And that's one way of understanding peace, right? Just leave us in peace, that kind of thing, right? But he's saying that's not the kind of peace we need. That's a negative peace because it is the absence of justice. He is asking for a positive peace that includes things that make us uncomfortable, tensions and disruptions like this. For him, that was a more positive peace than just having peace and order, right? So we're running a little bit out of time. So this is kind of one of the ways that, like we said, freedom is never given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed. And so these are some tactics that have been used. And here are just some other things that some posters and things like that. The art coming out of the Occupy movement all across the country, all across the world is absolutely amazing. Do a Google image search for Occupy and you will find thousands of art pieces, sculptures, drawings, posters, all kinds of things. This is another way that people sort of express themselves and have their voices heard, right? And if you haven't read it, you need to read a very important book by Howard Zinn called Artists in Times of War that talks about the role of art and sort of demanding things and demanding of the consciences of people to pay attention to unjust issues. So Will's going to talk a little bit about some of those issues before we wrap up.
And so to kind of bring it back into more of the present situation with the Occupy movement and some of the confusion that goes along with, well, what do they want, right? What's the objective? Because of the structure that was set up, because of a General Assembly and a forum for everyone to have their voices heard, you have a whole range of issues that affect citizens and that they want to voice a concern with it that hopefully becomes more public in order to inform others is part of that rationale, as well as just protesting. So some of them, just to go back to some more key ones that we've seen, events based around the effect of like money in politics, campaign finance reform and corporate personhood as a sense of really undermining what it really means to have free speech and what a vote really counts for. Income inequality. So some of the financial crisis has brought out different classes, right? We've heard the phrase class warfare being used, but it's really brought out the tension as to, in these times, who's benefiting and who's not, and what is basic fairness and through that. So income inequality is a really strong issue you'll hear a lot. Going back to corporate bailouts in the sense that the larger banks were bailed out to stabilize the system. People find it, Tea Party alike, find it inherently kind of an objection that there was a reward for that in some ways, in that they were actually, the infusion of funds brought them to a capacity that most of them was prior to even the collapse itself. So there's some tensions in there with how that worked out with housing, right? How are we going to deal with the housing crisis? Do we give the money to the banks? Do we give it to the homeowners who made bad decisions, right? So we give it to the banks, people were foreclosed on in their homes. It's not a black and white situation, but this is what happens. Rather than give it to the homeowners, they stay in their homes, the banks get their money. Instead, it's the way the consequences of those decisions in that time were made, it brought out a greater divide, right? Because the consolidations of bank and large money is one of the things that is understood in the Occupy movement to create some of these imbalances and lack of access. So other ones, student debt. So a lot of campuses, you'll see students really concerned about what the debt that they're going into and their opportunities for employment afterwards, foreclosure on homes, labor issues. That's part of the West Coast port shutdown involved the truckers, and there's a letter written just because of the conditions that they actually were working in, be surprisingly objectionable in a first world country like ours. So no bathroom access, no benefits of any kind, the list goes on and on. Environmental issues. The Occupy movement was used as a forum to really, by the environmental movement, to stop that pipeline. You guys heard the XL pipeline. That's an issue that came out. It's basically the tar sands in Canada is one of the largest carbon reserves left on Earth, and in order to actually process that, they were going to build a pipeline from Alberta, Canada, to basically the Gulf Coast in Texas, right across the United States. So, immigration issues, education funding cuts. So, where do the cuts come? Where do the tax cuts? What happens with the tax cuts? Those issues. One of the ones that was kind of hidden and not many people really paid a lot of attention to it, but the protesters really reacted pretty strongly to it, was the National Defense Authorization Act. Because embedded in this document, which is basically funding our military and some other agencies, was a clause that was going to, unconstitutionally according to the argument, grant the power of the military to detain without charges U.S. citizens indefinitely. So the rights and privileges that we take for granted and freedoms that we have in the United States through due process could potentially be abused there. I mean, the rationale is that that's done for real threats and terrorists, but there's some other posters and things that show you, like the Occupy movement's on the terrorist watch list. So that's where that tension kind of gets drawn out. Just to give you a glance at an idea.
And we could certainly talk about all of this stuff, and I could spend an entire semester talking about this stuff. So feel free to ask us questions. We're just going to wrap up real quick. So Martin Luther King stated in his letter that we're caught in this inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. He's so much more eloquent than me. But this is the clarion call of the Occupy movement, right? That all of these issues that Will is talking about are all related. They're all tied together. They all affect everyone in this country and across the world. They affect the 99%.
And so one of the things that's been echoed in our era today is, surprisingly, at the end of the year, Time magazine shows the Protestor as the person of the year. That is not by far the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement owes a great deal to those who have come before them. This started with the Arab Spring. We're all familiar with the Arab Spring. And then that, as that ignited across the Arab world, and there's a timeline that kind of shows you those events from country to country. And then, into Europe, into the United States and the Occupy movement, back over to Russia. This grassroots democratic renewal, in the sense that people actually have a power in rediscovering their voice, is happening. So Time magazine, regardless of politics, is acknowledging that the protester is an idea, as a person, was the most influential in our world in the past year. And there's a lot of significance to that.
So King stated 60 years ago that now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. It seems to me that we're really in this unique moment. I mean, maybe your grandparents, I guess, my parents were alive during the 60s, right? And they sort of were a part of that historical movement. Right now, whether you're involved in it or not, you are going to be asked about this in the future. Where were you during this very unique moment in history when this many people across the world, I mean, you saw that's like thousands in 80, countries all across the world started rising up and being involved in these kind of movements towards a more authentic form of democratic participation, and to really sort of harken back to this, this promise of democracy. Thank you guys so much for your attention. If you have any questions, we're welcome. You're welcome. Any questions for us before you run off to class?
You talked first about the proposals and the friendly amendments that happened during the Occupy movements. Could you give us an example of what one of those proposals would be, and where would it go from there? Would it be sent to government? Would it be like as an organized? Would it stay in the camp? Like, is it just?
Sometimes it's about where they'll devote their resources from donations. Sometimes it will be, this labor union has asked us to kind of endorse their march and join them in this march. And since there's no leader, the authority comes from the decision that the body makes itself through that process. So that's kind of, it's always, so that everyone has had a say. And sometimes, that doesn't always work out that way. People can feel alienated too, but, well.
And what was your reaction to the libraries, the Zuccotti Park, the New York Library, the Occupy Library that they had set up, and its later destruction by the police as they were clearing out the park?
That was actually one of the things that most, as an educator, just disturbed me, is that you had this spontaneous community that was gathering together, and whether or not the politics involved, and you can't necessarily put a finger on them totally, or something you agree to or not. It was people trying to take care of each other. There's a lot of goodwill there. And part of it was to empower one another through education. And thousands of books were brought together for people in this lending library. And on November 15th, when the police moved in at 1 a.m., everything, absolutely everything, was thrown in dumpsters. So to me, the metaphor of what's of value, right, and what's recognized as having an importance was I personally kind of felt that with the library. Like, who throws out a library? Thousands of books. Yeah.
I just want to point out something about that. There's actually a book online. You can find it through Kickstarter, which is how it was funded. It's about that whole process of the Occupy Library. But I think that particular thing shows the way that this occupation of public space brings out tension in the exercise of power. It shows abject lawlessness on the part of the authorities in the city of New York. The protesters who were there were not disobeying any laws. In fact, the park is apparently privately owned, but under a contract that requires the owners to allow it to be publicly open 24 hours a day, every day of the year, for the use of anyone, however they want to use it. And so it was basically a decision that was made by the city that they just wanted to get rid of people. There was no law underlying what they did. The justification was that they were defending private property, and the books are private property. They took the books and threw them in the dumpsters, disobeying the laws that require you, when you detain someone, to take their possessions and hold them and then return them to them when they're free. And since they assumed they wouldn't be able to find who it was, they just said, well, let's just throw it out. And that, to me, kind of follows on something that was said earlier about, the occupation of public space. One of the principles of democracy is habeas corpus, right? That the individual owns the body, that the citizen is the sole possessor of his or her own body. And so if you have a system that doesn't honor that very thing, or that claims to honor that in courts of law, but then doesn't honor the same sovereignty of the citizen over public space and over government, right? Because someone like Mayor Bloomberg and all of the police who work under him, they're servants of the people, including of the people in that park. You know, and I think that the tension that's brought out, as Will was saying, the tension that's brought out is the fact that when that is confronted, when those public officials are asked to confront this fact, they actually don't have any justification for their actions. To take action of that kind against citizens on what authority? They're the servants. They should be acting in the interests of those very citizens. So to me, that's what that library, you know, problem is about, is that it was actually an act of lawlessness that has not been dealt with, really.
And the way that they sort of do that in some places, and I don't know specifically about New York, but one of the things that they'll do, like if they know that a big protest is going to happen in a space, they'll quickly, the city governments will pass little local ordinances that say things like 3 people cannot congregate in this space for more than 10 minutes or they will be arrested, which is clearly like the most ludicrous sort of thing, right? But then as soon as the threat of the protest or whatever is over, oh, that's unconstitutional. Well, we'll get rid of that ordinance. It's about immediacy, right? It's about removing it from, you know, you can challenge it in the court later, of course, right? You're going to go to court. A lot of times I've been to court with people who are arrested during protests and their charges get dropped because it's not really about putting people in jail or enforcing those ludicrous laws. It's about, I'm going to get you out of that space right now and have that little ordinance to do it with. And then I'm going to say, oh, right, we shouldn't have had that. Let's get rid of it. But the damage is done, right? It's a way to silence in that moment. So I'm not saying that went on in New York, but that's what happens at a lot of like anti-globalization protests and things like that. Mm-hmm.
In the research I've done, I've always wondered, there's obviously a lot of power and legitimacy to a certain extent of the political system in America. Why hasn't the Occupy Wall Street kind of taken up a movement towards federalism? Because as you know, like the further away from home you kind of get, like with the media, we focus on Washington politics a lot, but if Occupy really started to concentrate on local government and taking more power in that, because you're so much more well represented on the state and county levels, and almost if they integrated a little bit more with like the political system in America, wouldn't they be more effective like legislatively?
Well, I don't know that that's their.
I know that's not their point, but wouldn't they
right.
maybe get much more done if they?
Well, I think they're trying very much to embody the local, right? Saying that we are the local people of this community. You know, we're in these little spots all over the country, right? And so what they're saying is that the systems as a whole, the system, local, state, federal, all of that system is broken, right, in that view. And so, again, I think they're still at the point where they're saying, okay, what are the issues before we start coming up with, well, maybe we should adopt federalism as a way, or maybe we should do it this way. And they're still in that sort of stage of saying, well, what are all the issues and possible solutions? Does that make sense?
Broken, but it's not irreparable.
Oh, sure.
In the Constitution, there's an extraordinary amount of power in local government to the point that the writers of the Constitution thought that people would be so involved in their state and local governments that they wouldn't even really care about the federal government and the president and things like that. It's become the opposite of that, and that's ironic. But I think if Occupy took on a goal in that direction, and maybe they will, I hope they will, because that type of reform would be very beneficial to individuals, especially since government has come to a place where it's so far away from the individual.
Absolutely.
It's frustrating to be reading. It's like, okay, you're calling for change, but why? There has to be some type of corporation, I think, with the broken political system that we have in order to get somewhere.
I think it's issue dependent too, like the different working groups, like the education ones, they do, you know, sit-in protests outside of the Department of Education in Philadelphia, like I think it's Thursday, every Wednesday. But I think it's somewhat issue contingent, and I'm fascinated by the dynamic of this because it defies definition in so many ways because it's leaderless. So some people really I've heard advocate for that, right, in the short little interactions I've had. And then you hear others say, no, we do not want to be co-opted in any way into a system, right, of media, of politics that kind of just puts you in one of two categories, right? And if you put everyone in one of two categories, then all the voices there are going to somehow be alienated from each other and one another, right? And those categories or was frustrating to the media and others in understanding it, because we tend to understand things in black or white terms, right? That you got to communicate something in a soundbite. Better be quick. Better fit a model of something you already understand, right? But it's also the strength of it in that it defies one definition, because there's no one person speaking for it in so many ways, right? There's only one city speaking for it, and one particular occupation group. But I mean, that is an argument, and I think a lot of people have kind of taken that route. Those who are more opposed to some federal regulations or things that are going on at that level tend to focus at that, right? Yeah.
This is just a general question. Do you have any recommendations for like resources, because this is a leaderless movement, so it's difficult to follow, and I feel like it's difficult to form an opinion without adequately hearing from both sides of the argument. Do you have any recommendations as to that?
I would definitely, if you're interested in getting a better understanding of the movement, to go to their independent media sources. So things like occupyphillymedia.org or com. .org.
Yeah.
You can just Google it. But like all the Occupy movements, when I said earlier I didn't want to vilify the media, because they are using the media in a lot of ways, right? They have Twitter feeds, they have Facebook pages. Each one has, media sites, constant videos. How many of you have a phone in your pocket right now? You can take pictures, you can take video and upload it instantly, and they do it constantly. So there's so much information out there. It's overwhelming, but it is very easy to find. And so you can sort of read those sources, read the independent media reports, and then read some of the mainstream stuff too, and see kind of, you have to be critical about all those sources and what you're getting. So, but there's so much information. If you do an Amazon.com search for Occupy, there are actual books as well, and Kindle books, written by people involved in the movement that they've already kind of gotten out and published. What is the one, This Changes Everything? Mm-hmm. Is that the name of it? Yeah, so there's all kinds of those kinds of sources as well. They put out a newspaper called Occupy,
The Occupy Wall Street Journal.
The Occupy Wall Street Journal. It looks like the Wall Street Journal.
It's really interesting,
so
fascinating
it's like
content
a newspaper
too, actually.
And those are available for free, right? You can, yeah. So,
Occupy Media.
You can't, if you look for it, it's there. It's tons of stuff. But you do have to be critical about the source, right? Be careful about what you're reading and think about it. So. Good question.
Tends to be a lot of splinter groups. A lot of Occupy Philly probably has 4 or 5 Facebook groups, but there's one with I think it's 28,000 likes or something, and that's generally what the GA is attached to. So yeah, if you guys are interested in those types of things, we can help you a little bit more on the side with that. But
any other questions? I know you guys might have class. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
wonderful.
thanks guys.